I want to welcome you to this paper on regulatory legal issues with creative financing, uh, navigating the regulatory minefield, a strategic guide to compliant real estate investment. Is it an end of an era? Reevaluating creative financing in a high stakes environment. So for decades, creative financing strategies like contract for deed and lease option were celebrated as flexible tools for real estate investors. They offered a streamlined path to closing deals and a simple remedy, forfeiture and eviction in the event of default. Well, however, the regulatory landscape has undergone a seismic shift, transforming these once popular methods into high stakes legal minefield. This paper provides a strategic framework for achieving investment goals not by circumventing the rules, but by structuring deals that are compliant, risk mitigated, and legally durable. The fundamental change is a shift in the legal philosophy. Across the country, legislatures and courts are increasingly recharacterizing, that means changing these transactions. So if it says a lease option or it says they're going to say, well, it looks like a lease option, but it's not. What an investor may view as a simple installment contract or lease are now often legally reclassified as a de facto mortgage. Now, whenever you have a mortgage, you have a foreclosure. This reclassification strips away the investor's primary advantage, the ability to quickly and inexpensively reclaim the property from a defaulting buyer. Instead, the investor is forced into the same costly and time-consuming judicial foreclosure process required by traditional banks. So, sustainable investment success in the current environment, therefore, requires a deliberate choice between two distinct paths: structuring the transactions to avoid financing regulations entirely, or embracing them through full documented compliance. Attempting to occupy a gray area in between is no longer a viable strategy, but an invitation for severe financial and legal penalties. The following sections will explore the specific federal and state level forces driving this change and outline a clear framework for navigating them successfully. The regulatory gauntlet, federal and state hurdles for investors. Understanding the modern real estate investment landscape requires recognizing the dual layers of regulation, federal and state, that govern any form of seller financing. Federal laws, primarily the Dodd-Frank and SAFE Acts, establish a nationwide baseline for compliance that applies to nearly every investor. State laws then create complex patchwork of specific, often severe risks, turning formerly routine transactions into potential legal disasters. So, what's the federal overlay? What's the Dodd-Frank? What's the SAFE Act? The Secure and Fair Enforcement for Mortgaging Licensing Act, SAFE Act, has a nationwide impact on investors who frequently offer seller financing. It mandates that any individual engaging in the business of a residential mortgage loan originator must be licensed. An RMLO is anyone who, for compensation, takes a residential loan application or negotiates its terms. So the days are over when you give a 1003 application to the tenant buyer to see if they can qualify, and then you hand that off to a mortgage broker. You can't do that. You need to have them get directly in contact with the residential loan originator. Now, while this act includes a de minimis exemption, it's very narrow, and the investor who provides financing for three or fewer owner financed properties in a 12-month period is generally exempt from the licensing. Exceeding this limit triggers the mandatory use of a licensed RMLO for every subsequent transaction. Layered on top of this is the Dodd-Frank's ATR rule, or ability to repay rule. You can go to consumerfinance.gov to learn about the ability to repay rule, which creates a tiered compliance system for small-scale investors. Under the one property exemption, the investor may provide seller financing for one property per year without needing to perform and document a rigorous ATR analysis. However, the second and third properties financed within a 12-month period under the three property exemption, the investor must make and document a good faith determination that the buyer can repay the loan. This involves a formal underwriting process. Key factors. If you go to consumerfinance.gov, you'll learn about these factors. Verified income and assets, current employment status, credit history, DTI ratio. Now, the critical investor takeaway. The federal law allows a non-licensed investor to provide seller financing for only one residential property per year without the burden of the ATR underwriting. For deals 2 and 3, the investor must perform rigorous ATR compliance. Exceeding 3 deals in a year requires the mandatory engagement of a licensed RMLO for all subsequent transactions. Now, every state's different. Every state is different. The legal minefield, the shift from eviction to foreclosure. The common theme across most restrictive state laws is the recharacterization of the buyer from a mere tenant to an equitable owner. Equitable owner is an important legal concept. The moment a court or statute determines that the buyer has acquired an equitable interest in the property, often after making just a couple of payments, the investor's legal remedies change profoundly. The simple, quick eviction process is eliminated, and the investor is forced to navigate a costly and time-consuming judicial foreclosure on the property. Typology of state-level restrictions on creative financing. Here's a table summarizing the 3 main categories of severe state-level restrictions that challenge real estate investors using non-traditional financing: contracts for deed, lease options, and installment sales. So here's a regulatory theme: punitive reclassification. In states like Texas and North Carolina, non-compliant contracts are not just voided, they are treated as illegal loans. Violations can trigger unfair trade practice claims, leading to severe penalties such as triple damages and forfeiture of all payments received. That's just awful. And statutory mortgage conversion. In states like Ohio and Oklahoma, the law explicitly converts a contract for deed into a legal mortgage once a certain threshold is met. So, for example, after 5 years or when 20% of the price is paid, that's in Ohio. At that point, judicial foreclosure becomes the only legal remedy for default. And strict procedural compliance. States such as Maryland and Illinois impose a rigid checklist of requirements. The seller must provide extensive disclosures, record the contract within a narrow time frame, and follow specific default procedures. Failure to comply with any single requirement can render the contract voidable by the buyer, who may then demand full refund of all payments made. These legal shifts directly challenge the viability of many traditional creative financing models. The next section analyzes the specific high-risk structures that are most likely to trigger these severe regulatory consequences. High-risk models, an analysis of common pitfalls. Certain creative financing structures, while historically popular for their perceived simplicity, now carry disproportionate legal and financial risk in the modern regulatory environment. Their core appeal, bypassing the formalities of traditional lending, is precisely what makes them targets for consumer protection laws. This section dissects two of the most common high-risk models, the non-compliant contract for deed and the subject to acquisition. Contract for deed and lease option, a strategy on life support. The traditional appeal for contract for deed, also known as installment land contract or land contract, was clear. The investor retains legal title to the property until the buyer pays the final installment, allowing for a quick forfeiture and eviction upon a default. However, this model now primary target of restrictive state regulation. In a number of jurisdictions, this strategy is not just discouraged, it's legally perilous. So we're going to go over some states here. Consolidated high-risk jurisdictions. Texas automatically reclassifies non-compliant contracts as mortgage-like sales, risking triple damages. North Carolina treats violation of its strict disclosure and recording rules as unfair trade practices with triple damages. Maryland allows a buyer to void the contract and demand a full refund if the seller fails a rigid procedural checklist. Virginia requires the seller to provide a warranty of habitability, requiring massive pre-sale liability. West Virginia mandates a formal right to cure process, eliminating the possibility of a quick forfeiture. Illinois grants buyers a statutory 90-day grace period to cure defaults, mirroring foreclosure timelines. Missouri imposes high daily penalties for failing to transfer title promptly after final payment. Ohio automatically converts the contract to a mortgage after 5 years or 20% of the equity paid, forcing judicial foreclosure. Colorado requires involving a public trustee for tax escrow and to oversee a formal foreclosure process. Indiana judicial precedent treats land contracts as equitable mortgages, making judicial foreclosure the only safe remedy. Oklahoma state law explicitly deems all contracts for deed to be mortgages, requiring judicial foreclosure for any default. Kentucky Supreme Court precedent eliminated forfeiture remedy, requiring a judicial sale to protect the buyer's equity. Minnesota mandates a formal statutory cancellation process with a lengthy 60 to 90-day cure period for the buyer. Oregon courts are highly protective of buyer equity, often forcing a judicial foreclosure for non-compliant contracts. Pennsylvania judicial interpretation leans heavily toward treating land contracts as equitable mortgages, forcing judicial foreclosure. Next is subject to acquisition and the due on sale clause. The subject to strategy involves an investor taking title to the property subject to the seller's existing mortgage, meaning the original loan remains in the seller's name while the investor makes payments. The core legal vulnerability of this model is the due on sale clause found in nearly every conventional mortgage. This clause gives the lender the right to accelerate the loan and demand the entire remaining balance be paid immediately upon transfer of title. Now, while the federal Garn-St-Germain Act creates specific exemptions to the due on sale clause, these do not protect the typical investor in a subject to deal. Exempt transfers are limited to non-sale scenarios, such as a transfer to a living trust where the borrower is a beneficiary, or transfer upon death of a joint tenant. The sale to an unrelated third-party investor is explicitly not protected. Now, land trust, what's that? It's a sophisticated risk mitigation tool, not a risk elimination tool that masks the transfer from the lender. So the strategy is in two-step process. First, the seller transfers legal title to the land trust where the seller is the initial beneficiary. This transfer is generally protected from acceleration by the Garn-St-Germain Act. Second, the seller assigns their beneficial interest, which is legally considered personal property, not real property, to the investor in a private transaction. This approach relies on the low probability of enforcement, not on the absence of the lender's legal right to accelerate the loan. Should the lender discover the transfer, they retain the full legal authority to call the loan due. Having examined these high-risk tactics, it's time to pivot from mitigation strategies to truly compliant, legally sound investment frameworks that are built for long-term success. So, a strategic framework for compliant and scalable investment. Instead of attempting to navigate the complexities and risks of outdated creative financing models, modern investors should adopt one of two distinct, compliant, and scalable strategies. These approaches are designed to achieve investment goals while entirely avoiding the regulatory pitfalls discussed through this paper. And we can frame them as lane A, the wholesaler, who never takes on the liabilities of ownership, and lane B, the compliant lender, who embraces the regulatory requirements to create a secure, enforceable asset. So here's strategy A, the assignment of contract model, wholesaling. In the assignment contract model, the investor's role is that of a middleman. The investor secures a contractual right to purchase the property from the seller, but never actually takes title or provides any form of financing to the end buyer. Instead, they find a final buyer, often a cash buyer or another investor, and assign their purchase rights to that buyer in exchange for an assignment fee. This model entirely circumvents the regulations discussed in this paper, including Dodd-Frank and the SAFE Act and the state-level executory contract laws. Because the investor never holds title and never extends credit, the complex rules governing lenders and sellers do not apply. Title transfers directly from the original seller to the end buyer in a single clean transaction, which completely avoids equitable ownership problem that triggers foreclosure requirements. The strategic advantage is the simplicity and low risk. So you're not untitled, there's no financing involved, there's no regulatory liability. Now, strategy B, the compliant seller finance mortgage. Now, this strategy, providing seller financing, but doing so in a way that's fully compliant with all the federal and state laws. The structure is identical to a traditional bank loan. The seller immediately conveys the deed to the buyer at closing and in return takes back two critical legal documents, the promissory note and a security instrument. The promissory note is the IOU, is a legally binding contract that establishes the existence of the debt, the principal amount, the interest rate, and the repayment terms. The security instrument. Now, this document creates a lien that ties the debt from the promissory note to the property as collateral. It gives the seller the legal right to foreclose on the property if the buyer defaults on their payments. The type of security instrument used has major strategic importance. The choice between a deed of trust and a mortgage dictates the time, cost, and complexity for the foreclosure process. Let's go through this table, comparison of security instruments for seller financing. Um, we're going to compare two things. We're going to compare the deed of trust, non-judicial foreclosure, and the mortgage, a judicial foreclosure. So let's go through the deed of trust first. Deed of trust, parties involved, three parties, borrower, lender, and neutral trustee. Foreclosure process contains a power of sale clause. Upon default, the neutral trustee can administer a public sale of the property without court involvement. Speed and cost, faster, typically 60 to 120 days, less expensive and more efficient. Risk to the investor, lower as the remedy is contractual and predictable. Preferred method for seller financing in non-judicial states. Common states, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, California, most common practice. Now let's go through the mortgage judicial foreclosure. The parties involved are the borrower and the lender, and requires the lender to file a lawsuit to obtain a court order authorizing a foreclosure sale. This is the problem. It's really long. It's 6 months to 2+ years, expensive due to legal fees and court backlogs. Higher, as the remedy is subject to judicial discretion, extensive buyer defenses, and court mandated delays. So these states, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Illinois, and conversion states, Ohio and Indiana. So this efficient contractual process stands in stark contrast to the slow, expensive, and court-mandated judicial foreclosures forced upon non-compliant investors in states like Ohio, Indiana, and Oklahoma. For investors, utilizing this compliant model, choosing a location is a key strategic decision. Be careful where you do solar financing. States where the faster non-judicial foreclosure process is commonly strategically preferable. So these states here: Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Mississippi, Tennessee. By embracing the role of the compliant lender, the investor gains a secure, enforceable asset with a clear and predictable remedy in case of default, avoiding the catastrophic risk of non-compliant structures. So in conclusion, the mandate for professional discipline. The era of casual creative financing for residential properties is decisively over in most jurisdictions. The legal landscape, shaped by robust federal regulations and punitive state consumer protection laws, no longer tolerates ambiguity. Investors who cling to outdated models like the non-compliant contract for deed or unwisely structured subject to deals are not being creative. They are exposing themselves to catastrophic legal and financial risk, including triple damages, contract rescission, and the loss of their entire investment. The modern investor's choice has been distilled into two clear and safe paths. The first is to operate as a pure wholesaler through the assignment contract model, earning fees by connecting the sellers and buyers without ever taking on the liabilities of property ownership or lending. The second is to act as a fully compliant lender using the seller financed mortgage model, which title is transferred immediately and all federal and state regulations are meticulously followed. The choice is no longer between creative and traditional financing. It's between building a scalable business as a professional deal maker or professional lender. The middle ground has been regulated out of existence. So navigating this complex environment is not a task for amateurs. Sustainable success requires strategic discipline and a commitment to professionalism. This means abandoning legally unsupported shortcuts and instead engaging in licensed professionals, including specialized real estate attorneys and residential mortgage loan originators, RMLOs, the essential partners in every transaction. So in closing, in today's market, compliance is not a burden. It is the cornerstone of a scalable and profitable investment strategy. You can print this if you want, and to get more, we will be in this section here. If you go to regulatory legal issues right here. So this is Brian Gibbons at REISkills.com. I hope you've enjoyed this regulatory uh, video. We enjoy putting this information out for all real estate investors. Thanks very much. I appreciate you visiting. Make sure that you visit REIskills.com.